put on his camera. Colleagues, friends, and our listeners from wherever you are, this is the Department of History and Archaeology, University of Nairobi Research Seminar. I just want to take this golden opportunity to welcome each and every one of you. For those of us who are tuning in from the US, we will say good morning. For those of us in Nairobi here is good afternoon. For those who are listening to us in India and China and Korea, we will say good evening. Today's presentation is actually a continuation of the series of staff seminars that we have had in this semester, which we themed histories of contested spaces, expropriation, governance, and post-colonial modernity in Kenya. The topic of our presentation today is why did we walk while the Asians ran? Peter Anyang Nyong'o and the Provocation of East Asian Economic Growth. Our speaker is Mr. Kevin Keller, who is going to be online today. We have had a couple of presentations online. And Kevin Keller is actually speaking to us from Shanghai in China. It's early evening over there. And Kevin is currently a PhD candidate in history at the University of Yale in the United States of America. His research interest is on the economic relations between China and the global South over the past 1 century. In today's presentation, Keller will ask a fundamental question. How has China's explosive economic growth since 1978 affected the way that leaders across the global South approach the task of developing their own countries? He proposes that China's recent history functions less as a model and more as a provocation. It prompts leaders elsewhere to reconsider their beliefs about how development should proceed, and it pushes them to see more aggressive deadlines for achieving economic growth. To illustrate this, Keller will explore the writings and speeches of Professor Anyang Nyong'o, a Kenyan academic and politician. Professor Nyong'o, as you know, he was once Professor of Political Science in our Department of Political Science and Public Administration, and currently he is the governor of Kisumu County. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, the moderator and discussant of this afternoon's session will be Professor Msambai Katumanga, my classmate, friend, and colleague. And thank you, Prof, in advance for agreeing to come and join us. And without much ado, it is now my pleasure to welcome Mr. Kevin Keller. Proceed from here. Thank you.
Hey, thank you for that introduction. The first thing I want to do is to thank the organizers of this seminar series. It's a real privilege to be able to share my work and to learn from this group. I'd also like to thank everyone who's taken the time to join us today, both in person and virtually. I think the talk I'll be giving today actually pairs pretty well with our previous lecture from Professor Chome. Like him, I'll be telling a story that starts really in the 1990s, and that hopefully can give us a new vantage point on controversies, not only in contemporary Kenyan society, but also more globally. My plan today is that I'll talk for maybe 50 minutes or so, and then we'll transition to a question and answer session. My talk will proceed in 5 parts. First, I'll introduce my research question. Next, I'll talk through 3 of my research findings. And finally, I'll share some concluding thoughts. I'll say right now that I'm very excited for the question and answer session. One of the attractions of studying recent history, which I do, I think, is that you can share your ideas with people who lived through the events you are describing. I expect that at least some people in this room probably personally knew or know at least some of the people I'll be discussing and participated in at least some of the movements I'll be covering. The story that I'm about to share with you all is one that I've been able to reconstruct through the written record. But as all historians know, that record is always incomplete. And so I'm really interested to hear about the recollections and insights of people participating in this seminar. So with that, I'll begin. Not too long ago, in the middle of the 20th century, most places in Africa and Asia had similarly low levels of wealth. In subsequent decades, however, several countries in East Asia achieved rapid growth, transforming into global economic powers. A question that emerges is this: how has that East Asian economic growth affected the rest of the developing world? From what I've read and listened to, I think there are 2 frequent answers. The first is that East Asia functions as a model and source of inspiration. The World Bank has pushed this line, as have political leaders from East Asia, ranging from Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore to Xi Jinping in the People's Republic of China. A second vantage point, or second perspective, is that East Asian economic growth has introduced a new threat to the Global South's resources and autonomy. This is the argument that underlies much of the recent writing on the, quote, rise of China. Work in this vein is often, I think, pretty florid. We read, for example, that China lays, quote, debt traps, that China makes other states, quote, safe for dictatorship, or that China, quote, spreads across the world like a looting machine. Both these perspectives, China as a model and China as a threat, contain some truth. Leaders across the Global South do take guidance from the East Asian experience, and they also do face new pressures and opportunities generated by the arrival of new economic powers. But as my talk today attempts to demonstrate, the foregoing narratives are also incomplete, missing some of the important yet subtle global repercussions of the East Asian economic miracles. I argue that East Asian economic growth has functioned also as a provocation. I mean this in 2 senses. First, the East Asian experience has caused leaders elsewhere to revisit first principles of development. Not only the relatively technical though important policy decisions that attract much of the attention and discussions of the East Asian model, but also more fundamental questions about what development means in the first place. Second, East Asian economic growth has raised expectations about the pace at which development can, should, or perhaps for political leaders legitimately to remain in power, must proceed. Leaders in the Global South have long wanted to develop quickly, but the East Asian economic experience seems to have accelerated and crystallized the deadline. To provide an account of this provocation, I canvassed the writings and speeches of Peter Anyang Nyong'o, a political scientist and politician in Kenya. This approach is inspired by the growing library of research, some of it produced by participants in this seminar series, that has established the agency of African states in their relations with global powers. Once we accept that this agency exists, various questions arise. For example, how have African leaders conceived of their own policy objectives? How have they balanced competing priorities? What situations have they tried to avoid? Satisfactory answers to these questions depend, at least in part, I think, on accessing the thinking of leaders. And Nyong'o has been unusually public and persistent in sharing his thoughts. After earning his PhD from the University of Chicago in the 1970s, he held academic posts and produced academic papers for more than a decade. He then entered politics in the 1990s, ascending for a few years in the early 2000s to the post of Minister for Planning and National Development. Later, he became governor of Kisumu County in Western Kenya. Throughout, he has written and spoken extensively about the question of Kenyan development. This work provides a valuable resource for scholars. From it, we can follow changes over time in how at least one person who has directly steered policy at a variety of levels has conceived of and tried to promote development. What do we gain by seeing East Asian economic growth as a provocation rather than a model or threat? I'll give an example that comes from my own research. My current work looks at Chinese lending to countries across the global south, including Kenya, in the 21st century, which climbed suddenly and sharply in the late 2000s and inspired countless anxious accusations of debt trap diplomacy. One question that still lacks a fully convincing answer is why so many countries chose to take out large, not particularly cheap loans from China. Most observers attribute it to some combination of naivety and corruption. Neither explanation, I think, is entirely adequate. The naivety account relies on an almost astonishing ineptness by global leaders who, like everyone else, surely remembered the painful debt crises of the 1980s and 1990s. The corruption account is on stronger footing. There are many well-proven instances of corruption related to Chinese loan-sponsored projects, and there are aspects of Chinese lending, such as its secrecy, that could systematically enable corruption. But the corruption account does have its limits. It can be difficult to untangle corruption as a cause of lending activity from corruption as an unfortunate consequence. There is also the fact that Chinese loans, along with enabling corruption, have also supported many completed projects, especially in the realm of infrastructure. These achievements, to my eye, suggest that something more than just corruption is motivating at least some leaders in borrowing states. So for my research, what is missing and what the idea of a provocation means to supply is a sense of what could have pushed leaders across the globe into thinking that Chinese loans were a wise move, regardless of the risks. To flesh out the contours of this provocation, the rest of this talk proceeds in 3 parts, each of which identifies a change in Nyong'o's thinking. First, I'll discuss the growing importance of East Asia in Nyong'o's ideas about Kenyan development. Second, I'll describe Nyong'o's changing stance on the relationship between wealth, democracy, and empowerment. Third, and most tentatively, I'll cover Nyong'o's changing perspective on the pace at which development should proceed. All right, so let's get into the first part of the talk, which is about the growing importance of East Asia in Nyong'o's thinking about Kenyan development. I think it helps to have perhaps a little more biographical information before I go farther. When Kenya gained full independence from Great Britain, Nyong'o was enrolled as a student at the prestigious Alliance High School in Kikuyu. On the night of December 12, 1963, in a ceremony attended by Kenya's nationalist leader Jomo Kenyatta, Nyong'o watched as Kenya's new national flag was raised up the flagpole at Uhuru Stadium. He later wrote, quote, "It was like seeing a brave new world open up, to challenge all those who had longed for freedom to climb up its ladder into the unknown of the starry night." A few decades later, in the 1980s, as the political and economic situation of most African states drifted increasingly far from the ideals of those early years of decolonization, Nyong'o researched from a variety of academic posts the operation of Africa's political economy. In the early 1990s, he entered politics himself. He belonged to a group of ambitious, energetic politicians who were labeled the Young Turks and opposed the authoritarian regime of Daniel Arap Moi. He won a seat in parliament in 1992 and then lost it in 1997. The main development in Kenyan politics in the 1990s was the slow transformation of widespread but badly fractured animosity to the Moi regime into a coordinated political movement. The process was finally completed in 2002 when a coalition of opposition groups managed to unite long enough to defeat Moi's proposed replacement for president. Nyong'o is one of the intellectual leaders of this movement, and when the new administration took office, he was tapped for the spot of Minister for Planning and National Development. It was in this capacity that on August 5th, 2004, Nyong'o gave a speech to a group of Asian ambassadors and high commissioners gathered at the Lord Errol restaurant in Nairobi. The title of his talk was, quote, "Why did we walk while the Asians ran?" In it, he confronted the question of why, since the 1970s, several states across East Asia had experienced economic growth that was much more rapid than Kenya's or most other African states. He said, quote, "I have just come back from a trip to Langkawi in Malaysia, and I was struck by the awesome progress that Malaysia has made in the last 25 years. He pointed out that in the early phases of decolonization, the roles had been reversed, with Kenya serving as an inspiration for other states. He described a conversation with Malaysian leaders in which they recalled a visit they had made to Nairobi in the mid-1970s. As they told it, they had been amazed by Nairobi's infrastructure and smooth system of public transport. Nyong'o told his audience, quote, "Kuala Lumpur was nothing like this. So Malaysian leaders decided they would make their capital as good as or better than Nairobi," end quote. To explain the divergence between Kenya and East Asia over the next 30 years, Nyong'o rejected any theory that relied on culture, geography, or ability to adhere to macroeconomic policies recommended by external donors. Instead, he suggested that the problem was a lack of innovation in the Kenyan economy. He concluded the talk by saying that, quote, "In 1955, the Bandung Conference united us, Africa and Asia, in rejecting colonialism. Let us now use the same spirit to infuse greater cooperation between Kenya and East Asia." Dating at least back to the 1980s, Nyong'o had tried to understand Kenya and its developmental experience by comparing it to other states. In his earlier work, however, the comparison tended to be with other locations in Africa. He approached Kenya's political economy as one manifestation of a larger African pattern. The emergence of a, quote, "authoritarian presidency" in Kenya, for example, reflected a larger trend in which, quote, "almost in every African country, nationalist political parties had allowed power to pool in the hands of a single leader." Scholars in the 1980s were already starting to inquire what the East Asian approach to economic growth might offer to leaders elsewhere. To the extent that Nyong'o engaged with this conversation, his purpose was often to distinguish Africa as a region. He wrote in 1991, quote, "Contrary to arguments advanced regarding the Latin American and Asian experiences," end quote, "authoritarianism would not contribute to economic growth in Africa. Unlike in locations such as Singapore, it would result in, quote, increased consumption by bureaucrats and kleptocratic politicians," end quote. Sorry, I think I was muted for a second, but I think I'm back. In 1994, Nyong'o visited Singapore as part of a delegation of African leaders. During the tour, he attended a lecture by Lee Kuan Yew, who had recently stepped down from his multi-decade tenure as both Prime Minister of the country and Secretary General of the powerful People's Action Party. The experience seems to have affected Nyong'o deeply. He would refer to the lecture frequently in his speeches and writings over the following years. The details would shift, but a constant theme was that the lecture exposed to Nyong'o, or perhaps just persuaded him of, the contingency and therefore needlessness of Kenya's economic struggles. As Nyong'o tells it, the lecture concluded with a question and answer session. Nyong'o asked Lee to explain the different economic trajectories of Kenya and Singapore since the 1970s. Lee's response, reportedly, was, quote, "that while we in Singapore decided to march forward as a nation, you in Kenya decided to assassinate Tom Mboya." Now, Nyong'o almost certainly did not take the statement literally. Mboya, as everyone in this room probably knows, was an intellectual and political leader from the early years of Kenyan independence, who in 1969 was murdered in downtown Nairobi. Nyong'o wrote about Mboya frequently and admired him greatly, once describing him as, quote, "fitting comfortably in the team of such world leaders like Martin Luther King, John and Bobby Kennedy, Kwame Nkrumah, and Nelson Mandela," end quote. But Nyong'o did not see Mboya as all-powerful, nor as a saint. Nevertheless, even if Nyong'o did not believe that Mbowe's assassination was entirely responsible for Kenya's economic struggles, he still might have accepted the premises on which Lee's statement rested. The first was that Singapore's experience could be attained by Kenya. The second was that it was a question of leadership. Following his encounter with Lee Kuan Yew, and presumably inspired at least in part by what he saw in Singapore, Nyong'o began to modify his scholarly approach. Countries outside of Africa, and especially countries in East Asia, began to capture a larger amount of his attention. His talk on Why Did We Walk While the Asians Ran is probably the most explicit demonstration of this trend, and his focus on East Asia in that talk is surely attributable in part to the fact that he was speaking to a group of Asian diplomats. But the renewed attention to East Asia pervades much of his work. In 2000, he published a series of short essays in a USAID-funded pamphlet about privatization in Kenya. He described a short sabbatical he had taken to Mexico City in 1996, during which time he had studied privatization programs in countries across the globe. He wrote that he was particularly struck by what he had learned about the Meiji Restoration in Japan. He wrote, quote, "The African faith in public enterprises in the early years of independence as a way of stimulating development or encouraging capital formation was not altogether ill-placed, nor did it lack historical precedent." He went on to explain that, quote, "From the Meiji Restoration onwards, Japan started a process of industrialization that was a mix between public enterprises and individual entrepreneurship," end quote. Nyong'o did not present the Japanese experience as entirely positive. He noted, for example, that, quote, "individual freedom was subjugated for public glory," end quote. But he did apply himself to uncovering which specific aspects of Japanese policy or culture, absent in Kenya, might have contributed to Japan's economic growth. Nyong'o was a scholar, and it was in this mode that he undertook his study of Japan, in the pamphlet I was just discussing, in which he treated Japan's economic growth as a record against which he could test different theories of development and potentially produce knowledge to inform Kenyan public policy. But as we all know, Nyong'o was also a politician, and in that mode, he more often took East Asian economic growth simply as a powerful, difficult to contest fact with which to browbeat himself and his colleagues across the continent. At a 2005 conference for African political leaders, for example, he reproached his audience for delegating important policy decisions to foreign development, quote, experts. He said, quote, "We know that Asians did it by themselves. Why are we, as Africans, afraid to do it by ourselves?" So now we have the first change in Nyong'o's thinking, the rise in the importance and relevance of East Asia. I'll now move on to the second change in Nyong'o's thinking, shifting understandings of the relationship between wealth, democracy, and empowerment. Before we get there, though, I offer a very brief digression. Entitling his speech, "Why Did We Walk While the Asians Ran?" Nyong'o was almost certainly making a reference to Julius Nyerere, the former president of Tanzania. Nyerere was one of the leaders of the intellectual and political movement known as African socialism, which sought to adjust socialist theory to fit the specific circumstances of post-colonial Africa. In a speech that later became famous, Nyerere told a classroom of children that Tanzanians needed to work harder than people in countries that were already rich. Or, as he put it, quote, "We must run while they walk." Nyong'o's invocation of Nyerere suggests, I think, a person in the process of reconciling various strands of developmental theory. In his earliest academic work, Nyong'o wrote in a fairly doctrinaire Marxist mode about the operation of Kenyan society. Now, in an homage to one of the more radical leaders of African socialism, he called for measures more readily associated with the Washington Consensus of the 1980s and 1990s, such as macroeconomic stability and market-driven deregulation. Anyway, bringing us back to the task at hand, as both an academic and government official, one of Nyong'o's central preoccupations was to unravel the relationship between democracy, poverty, and what he referred to as empowerment. This forced him constantly to reckon with two sets of questions. The first was definitional. What counted as empowerment? Was democracy a necessary component? Was wealth? The second set of questions was tactical. If the objective of a policymaker was empowerment, what should or must come first? Democracy or poverty alleviation? These were questions that confronted all leaders in post-colonial states in the early years of independence. They were also questions that received obsessive attention from political scientists. One landmark work was Samuel Huntington's Political Order in Changing Societies. Published in 1968, the book was a response to the pervasiveness of violence after decolonization. To put it crudely, Huntington did not see democracy as particularly valuable or productive for newly independent states. In the early phases of decolonization, Huntington argued American researchers and policymakers had focused aggressively on improving the economic performance of new states, assuming that increased wealth would contribute to political stability. This theory, Huntington wrote, was based on American confidence in, quote, the unity of goodness, which held that, quote, all good things go together, and that the achievement of one desirable social goal aids in the achievement of others, end quote. Huntington argued that this model was unsupportable in the context of decolonization, where populations had been thrown together with little sense of shared affinity and where new political institutions had to compete against already existing and, to many people, more compelling sources of political authority. In this context, Huntington argued, the suppression of political rights in newly independent states might facilitate the building of stable and, quote, legitimate public order, end quote. This stability, in turn, could allow for economic growth. In his academic work from the 1980s and early 1990s, Nyong'o railed against all of this. He considered Huntington to be one among many misdirected, quote, development boffins in Africa, end quote. To Nyong'o, Huntington's work had ended up justifying the establishment of authoritarian one-party states. In the early years after decolonization, Nyong'o contended, there had existed across Africa widespread demand for democratic rights and democratic arrangements of states. As a wave of military regimes washed across the continent, however, the new leaders had demoted or postponed democratic initiatives and justified autocracy on the basis that it was necessary for stability, which was itself necessary for development. Those leaders had drawn on Huntington, but now in the 1980s and 1990s, writing later than Huntington and with a correspondingly richer set of historical precedents, Nyong'o concluded that Huntington and his followers had been wrong on at least two counts. After 30 years of independence, Nyong'o wrote, there is no convincing correlation between dictatorships or authoritarian regimes and higher levels of economic growth or development in Africa. Moreover, to Nyong'o, Huntington's theory seemed to rest on an outmoded characterization of development or economic growth as an objective, unqualified good. Nyong'o insisted, quote, questions of development cannot be settled through technocratic arguments. Rather, he continued, they required sorting out priorities, or this isn't a quote, rather they required sorting out priorities between groups of people and across different timeframes. Any process that resolved those questions without the involvement of the affected populations would be, in Nyong'o's word, unjust. So as he entered the 1990s, Nyong'o had reached certain conclusions about what development looked like and how it should proceed. In the introduction to an edited volume to which he also contributed, he wrote, the position taken by all the essays in this book is that political liberties and the accountability of the state to the people is a precondition for material progress. Over the next decade, however, this proposition that political liberties were a precondition for material progress would come under strain from a variety of directions. There was the global turn towards basic needs, in which attention and money in the aid community came increasingly to fixate on marginally raising the incomes of the world's poorest people. There was also Nyong'o's own bruising experiences in Kenyan politics. In 1991, together with the other Young Turks, he had formed an opposition political party named the Forum for the Restoration of Democracy. The rationale behind the name was that they hoped to unwind President Moi's multiple authoritarian measures, such as the restriction on opposition parties, and to recover the political pluralism that had at least formally existed very briefly in the earliest moments of Kenyan independence. Within a year, however, the party collapsed under the weight of interethnic quarrels. This was a challenge that had faced all Kenyan political movements that tried to mobilize above the level of ethnicity, and it left Nyong'o skeptical of whether there existed in Kenya a viable tradition of African democracy. In a morose essay that he wrote in 2000, he wrote, "The name, Forum for the Restoration of Democracy, was itself a contradiction in terms." He went on to say, quote, "We cannot possibly restore what had not actually been there." The 1990s also saw the crowning of several East Asian tigers or miracles as models for effective economic development. These included Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and South Korea. This was the era in which Nyong'o took his formative trip to Singapore, part of a group of African leaders tasked with collecting strategies for economic growth. As later writers would point out, there was always something at least a little bit odd about this frenzy of attention over East Asia, especially when it focused on Hong Kong or Singapore, financial hubs that could not sensibly be treated as models for countries such as Kenya, with predominantly rural populations spread across large territories. But the fact that several countries located close together had all sustained economic growth was, reasonably enough, something that many people saw as an event that demanded explanation. One salient characteristic shared by the most impressive of these miracles was that they had been achieved under fairly authoritarian rule. It was hard not to see this as at least somewhat significant. Samuel Huntington's work, battered throughout the 1970s and 1980s by the abysmally poor performance of military rulers across the world, seemed for many due for a reassessment. For example, Francis Fukuyama, writing in 2006, described East Asia as a vindication for Huntington's theory of, quote, modernizing authoritarianism. In the early 2000s, as Minister of Planning and National Development, Nyong'o continued to meditate on the meaning of empowerment and the method of achieving it. He seemed to relax his earlier insistence on the primacy of political participation. For example, one of his first major tasks as minister was to prepare a 5-year plan. That document, issued in June 2003, was titled Economic Recovery Strategy for Wealth and Employment Creation. In it, he continued to emphasize the importance of democratic participation. He wrote, quote, "This recovery program gives priority to good governance and the rule of law as the foundation for economic growth." But he also contended that, quote, "physical and social infrastructure are extremely vital for the creation of wealth and development in general." The concept of infrastructure in the document swept pretty broadly, covering matters such as public health and education, and it also took up a majority of the plan. One way to explain Nyong'o's broadened ideas about the priorities in achieving empowerment is as a political expedient. After his coalition gained power, it needed to provide immediate, tangible benefits to its voters. This is undoubtedly true. Nyong'o acknowledged it, writing shortly after the election that democracy had to go hand in hand with economic empowerment as an election dividend. But this rationale for the increasing place of wealth in Nyong'o's thinking also probably misses the depths of the changes in how Nyong'o perceived the task of development and empowerment. For years after the election bringing his coalition into power, Nyong'o continued to fixate on the urgency of increasing personal wealth. In a 2005 speech, he called for the accumulation of capital by the Kenyan people. He offered his mother as an example. Suppose she had 3 goats, he said. He wanted her to have 5, and then 8, and then 10, and eventually so many that she could sell some and use the money, and, quote, use the money to buy shares in the stock market in Nairobi, end quote. So, pulling this all together, as Nyong'o progressed through his career in national politics, His thinking about political participation, wealth, and empowerment seemed to transform in two ways. First, he tempered his faith in political participation as a necessary mechanism for good policymaking. In a speech from 2004, he observed that, quote, few good ideas ever come from crowds, committees, and commissions. He went on to say in that speech that, quote, if anything, most ideas that have inspired mass movements and changed societies for the better or for the worse have come from individual persons, end quote. Second, and much more frequently, he questioned whether political participation could exist meaningfully without a minimum foundation of physical and material well-being. In a 2003 speech, Nyong'o pointed out that, quote, persons without education will be denied the opportunity to develop their personal capacities even in a democratic society, end quote. Similarly, he continued, quote, an individual afflicted by sicknesses and with no means or knowledge to prevent or cure such sickness is rendered powerless, end quote. Nyong'o went on to describe his coalition's approach to governing. Quote, while expanding the democratic space and institutionalizing a democratic culture in our society, he said, we must empower our people to make full use of democracy. The problem, he continued, was that, quote, a poor person could not do that. So early in his career, Nyong'o had felt compelled to pick apart a development orthodoxy built on two mutually reinforcing but equally flawed ideas. First, that empowerment meant economic strength, and second, that the suspension of political rights could be justified on economic grounds. From what I've seen, he never lost his skepticism of that old orthodoxy. But as he contended for and gained national office, he did moderate his ideas on what should take its place. He showed a growing concern for individual wealth, both as a component of empowerment and as a precondition for robust democracy. He continued to view political participation as an important aspect of and catalyst for empowerment, but it became framed less as the central challenge for Kenyan development and more as something that had to be pursued in tandem with wealth creation. Now, like I said before, this was all overdetermined. It reflected a growing global anxiety over basic needs and extreme poverty, and it probably stemmed, at least in part, from Nyong'o's personal disillusionment over Kenyan politics. But given Nyong'o's increasing preoccupation with East Asia, it was also likely influenced by that region's economic growth. The record of authoritarian regimes in East Asia seems to have corroded Nyong'o's faith in robust democracy as a necessary precondition for wealth and empowerment. This is not to say that Nyong'o became an advocate for an authoritarian rule, but the East Asian experience might have prompted Nyong'o to expand his gaze, recasting political participation less as the essence of empowerment and more as one among several characteristics of an empowered society. It also may have transformed individual wealth from a far-off goal for post-colonial societies into something that actually could be achieved and achieved quickly. Which brings us to the third and final part of this talk, Nyong'o's changing ideas about the speed of development. I'm actually going to take us for a moment back to the 1960s because I think it will be helpful. In 1965, Tom Mboya gave a lengthy speech on the floor of Parliament that considered, among other matters, the question of speed. Under his leadership, the Ministry of Economic Planning and Development had recently shared Sessional Paper Number 10, a landmark document in the history of Kenyan governance. It laid out a national development plan under the title of African Socialism and its applications to Kenya. In his speech, Mboya said, quote, we all agree that certain changes must take place, end quote. The only grounds for debate to him were, quote, the interpretation of the time factor involved and the most effective way of solving our short-run problems, end quote. He conceded the obvious point that economic growth should ideally be quick, but he also reminded Parliament that there were obstacles that Kenya needed to overcome. He gave as an example the matter of professional manpower. It took decades to train doctors, he pointed out. Even accounting for the country's recent strides in growing the primary school system, it would not be until the late 1970s that some of those newly captured students would have completed their medical training. Mboya insisted, quote, that development takes time. He was irritated by policy proposals calling for the immediate rollout of free education and free medical services, which he saw as, quote, propaganda, end quote, that ignored Kenya's severe resource constraints. He said, quote, it is not enough to dismiss these points and to mislead the people as to how fast we can move. This question, the question of speed, did not seem to interest Nyong'o much in his early years as an academic. That's not entirely surprising. Among many of the leading scholars that Nyong'o was reading and responding to, the dominant task was explaining the causes of development, or as a more critical strand of the literature framed it, underdevelopment. Questions related to the pace of development received less attention. For example, how quickly could a society develop, whatever that meant? Or how quickly must development proceed for a government to maintain legitimacy? Or how much pain could people reasonably be expected to tolerate in order to accelerate the development process? At times and in certain places, these questions had attracted enormous intellectual energy and had fueled immense social experiments. Probably the highest profile example was the Great Leap Forward in China, when a feverish desire to rapidly overhaul the country's economic foundations in the late 1950s inspired radical changes in agricultural production and resulted in tens of millions of deaths from starvation. But as Nyong'o entered his career, these questions of speed remained nearer the periphery of the academic investigations of development in the circles in which he traveled. Meanwhile, in East Asia, increasing evidence was emerging that substantial economic growth was possible for post-colonial states in at least some situations, and that it could be realized in as little as 20 or 30 years. Up through the early 1970s, Kenya's wealth as measured by per capita GDP was roughly equal with much of East Asia. This was the era when, as we'll recall, a delegation from Malaysia had toured Nairobi and admired the public transportation. Then several countries in East Asia started to grow rapidly. In Malaysia, between 1970 and 1995, per capita GDP grew from approximately US $375 to US $4,500. Even more remarkable trajectories occurred over the same period in South Korea and Singapore. As Nyong'o entered office in the early 2000s, it was becoming increasingly difficult to frame these rapid growth trajectories as flukes or temporary phenomena, similar to Kenya's own years of impressive GDP growth in the early years of independence. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 had done serious damage to many countries, but it had not pressed wealth levels anywhere near where they had been before the miracles began, and many of those countries also seemed to be recovering. There was also the matter of China, which since 1982 had almost never experienced a year in which the growth of GDP per capita fell below 6%. In Nyong'o's writing as a government official in the 2000s, there appeared to be an increasing preoccupation with the speed of development. Sometimes this came through in concrete deadlines for development programs. He declared in the introduction to the economic recovery strategy of 2003, quote, "We shall definitely transform this nation from a third world nation to a prosperous and modern nation in the next 25 years. In an essay several years later, he wrote that, quote, "I had very good ideas on how we could reach double-digit growth within the 5th year of our government." Now, of course, some of the impulse for these timelines came from the structure of Kenyan politics. For example, the need to notch economic successes before rounds of national elections. But I think East Asia also functioned as a benchmark. In a speech he gave in Nigeria in 2006, for example, Nyong'o pointed out that, quote, "In less than 20 years, Malaysia has developed from a poor third world country into a medium income modern society that will say goodbye to poverty before 2015. Nyong'o's concern with speed was also suggested by his frequent invocation of economic leaps. The word leap here is important, and I'll warn up front that what I'm about to say is pretty speculative. For a collection of his speeches and essays published in 2007, Nyong'o chose the title, A Leap into the Future. In his speech, Why Did We Walk While the Asians Ran?, he started by saying, quote, I do believe that we can leap into the future in terms of development. Nyong'o might have used the word leap casually as a convenient and evocative metaphor for swift economic growth. But he might have used the word more intentionally. He was well-versed in Marxist theory, and in that realm, a leap can function as a term of art. As a general proposition, Marxist intellectuals take as one of their central tasks the explanation of how societies progress through various stages of political economic formation. As sinologist Stuart Schramm puts it, one strand of that thinking holds that, quote, development takes the form of gradual quantitative change leading to qualitative changes, or leaps, end quote. In other words, the idea of a leap suggests that social change does not necessarily proceed at a steady pace. Instead, a society that seems fairly static, with perhaps only a few signs of movement around the edges, can in fact be inching itself towards sudden, explosive transformation. It was a particularly strong version of this theory that justified the Great Leap Forward in China. In a much more dilute form, it is a notion of development that might have allowed Nyong'o to reconcile his ambitious plans for Kenya with the sometimes discouraging views he gained from his perch as a national minister. Even if his coalition made apparently so slow progress on social, economic, and political fronts, it remained possible that something extraordinary might materialize. The goal of rapid development, of course, was not a new arrival in the 1990s and 2000s, nor was the practice of tossing out somewhere between 20 or 30 years as a rough horizon for developmental plans. For example, a high-level official for a UN Special Fund for Development reportedly said in 1958 that, quote, if we do our jobs well, we'll be out of business in 25 years, end quote. One of Julius Nyerere's biographers wrote in 1981 that, quote, in the beginning, Nyerere had thought it would take Tanzania 30 years to build a socialist society, end quote. What changed in the 1990s, however, was that 20 or 30 years became an increasingly plausible timeline for realizing significant change. The economic growth achieved by several countries in East Asia since the 1970s suggested that, under at least some circumstances, it was possible for a country emerging from colonization to quickly scale the global economic ladder. For leaders in the global South, such as Nyong'o, fast economic growth had been converted from an aspiration into a possibility. So those are my findings. As way of a conclusion, I want to bring us forward by a decade to the mid-2010s and to an appearance that Nyong'o made on the news panel show Sidebar. A little bit of context is necessary before we get there. Between 2014 and 2015, as I suspect many here remember, Kenya took out a series of loans worth more than US $5 billion from the Export-Import Bank of China to build a new railroad from the port of Mombasa up to Nairobi and theoretically onto the border of Uganda. The project proved to be enormously controversial. The first phase of the railway from Mombasa to Nairobi was built ahead of schedule, allowing President Kenyatta to take a triumphant ride shortly before his successful re-election campaign. But as we all know, the railroad was also expensive, harmful to the environment, disruptive to several existing industries, and tainted by corruption. Chinese contractors had not used cutting-edge technology. Funding dried up partway through the project, and so the line terminated not at the border of Uganda, but in a field near the city of Naivasha. So in May 2017, Nyong'o appeared on the show Sidebar to join a discussion about the railway. He described it as, quote, a good project that has been invaded by cartels who do not mean well for this country. end quote. He advised patience. Other high-profile commentators had already decided that the railway was an economic failure. Nyong'o suggested waiting a year. He emphasized that the problems with the railway related to implementation, not to the grander ambitions that had inspired it. To explain this point, he referred to China. Quote, he said, quote, "You must think of the Great Leap Forward. It was disastrous under Mao. But from 1978 forward, after the reforms, the principles of the Great Leap Forward are actually working. They," by which he meant China, "are doing things ahead of their time," end quote. He described watching Nixon's 1972 visit to China and seeing that China was in an economic situation similar to Kenya's. He said, quote, "Because of their determination to leap into the future, they have done things you cannot believe. So I think as Africans, we should not be content with too little. We should be more ambitious," end quote. Julius Nyerere once told his biographer, quote, "Sometimes I wish I could put Tanganyika on another planet," end quote. He was exhausted by comparisons. He said, quote, "Then we could give it 100 years to catch up. But we can't do that. We can't isolate ourselves," end quote. He explained that expectations for leaders in the decolonizing world were based not only on local context, but also on what others were able to achieve, even under profoundly different circumstances. He said, quote, "The Maasai know that these things are possible. Milk for children, clean water, good houses. These things are objective, desirable, necessary," end quote. As I hope my talk today has shown, in the decades since Nyerere left office, this dynamic has only intensified. At a 2005 conference on construction in East Africa, Nyong'o asked, quote, "Could we also find out why it is that other rapidly developing countries can design, build, and maintain first world infrastructure while we borrow money to design, build, and not maintain third world infrastructure?" He pushed on, quote, "Is there anything intrinsically different between a Malaysian road engineer and one from Kenya, Ethiopia, Sudan, or Tanzania?" End quote. The last thing I want to emphasize before I wrap up is that at no point did Nyong'o advocate for a wholesale replication in Kenya of an East Asian developmental program. In his speech, "Why Did We Walk While the Asians Ran?" he said that Kenya had, quote, "something to learn from the East Asian countries as well as China," end quote. I think the specific wording here is important and is often missed by people who describe East Asia as a model for others. Nyong'o said that Kenya had, quote, "something to learn from Asia." But as we all know, learning from someone is not the same as copying them. Often it is the opposite. Nevertheless, East Asia did form an increasingly irresistible and sensitive point of comparison. In many ways, and in the not too distant past, new economic powers in East Asia had resembled many of the countries that still occupied the lower rungs of global wealth rankings. For leaders such as Nyong'o, these miracles in East Asia suggested that rapid economic growth was possible and pushed those leaders to reconsider how to achieve it. Thank you.
Friends, ladies and gentlemen, history is always my second home. As a political scientist, we always believe you first of all have to be a historian before you can actually purport to want to think in political terms, even though sometimes when we want to make fun of the historians, we think about them in terms of their archival ability. So there's archival material where we go to get what we want, and then we move forward. But for all practical purposes, I think after my journey as a political scientist, I'll come back home. So I hope the department will welcome me at a certain point. Keller, I must first of all thank you and appreciate you quite a lot. and together with the history department for inviting me to come and share a few notes about your presentation and perhaps a way forward. I will not be as elaborate as you've been in your reading of your work, but I hope you'll bear me if you find some little bit of halting of some issues here and there. But more fundamentally, let me not necessarily take you through the steps of what he set himself out to do, other than just recalling for you in a recapitulation, his initial appreciations, which have to do with trying to understand the model of East Asia development as an inspiration for Africa, as a perspective in terms of whether it is more of a threat or conceived as a threat, consequent to what they perceive as the process of resource extraction and the debt kind of a crisis. And then his perspective, which he wants to push, more specifically what he's calling as, what he looks at as the provocation thesis, and within which trying to understand what type of lessons and what essentially principles of development are and what they mean to Africans, and to more a larger part of an extent, whether in fact it's basically a process of legitimization, especially for those in power, to sustain their longevity over the same, all right? And so the aspect here that he has belabored is sometimes to try and wonder whether, in fact, Africans are being provoked, or more specifically, whether they have something to learn, which I think is tenable, something to learn, but not necessarily an argument that they do not have an idea about what they want to do. And so the aspect of urgency there is very apt, and more specifically, the leading questions that he wants to look at. So I would not belabor that. It's not so much about what he has said, but perhaps is more about a few issues here and there, starting off with the whole conception of Nyong'o as a point of entry or a unit of analysis. I want to thank him more specifically because, at least if he succeeds, I'm assuming that the end state of this process is probably his PhD. So if he succeeds in doing that, he will actually be walking within the realms or the footsteps of the likes of Rohio and what have you in the African political thought. So it'd be interesting. I hope that the Department of History takes up this particular issue in terms of trying to encourage our own students to, as much as possible, try to re-examine some of the thought process of these political gurus, especially the likes of Nyong'o, with respect to two aspects. One is in terms of trying to grapple with theory, with the questions of theory, and deriving the same theory from the aspects of praxis itself, right? And so among some of the issues we'll be looking at, perhaps recapitulating on the question of development, nexus with democracy, and perhaps the aspect of growth, but bringing into consideration also the security dynamics that comes with respect to that in terms of state development and consolidation. And the second aspect is in terms of the policy questions, the role of indigenous policy actors and the external actors with respect to the same. But before doing that, there is the aspect of the conceptual framework, of course, the methodology itself, which has to do with the largely secondary data and documentary access, which allows one to then try to analyze Nyong'o from what he has written, what he has essentially said. But I thought at a certain point, it may be very interesting if Keller buys a little bit of time, comes to Kenya and tries to interrogate and talk to Nyong'o's contemporaries, thinking about the likes of Mike Chege, Professor Mike Chege, Professor Njuguna Ng'ethe, Dr. Willie Mutunga, and others, who will then give him an aspect, a perspective about their colleague over time in space. And then, of course, secondly, there's the aspect of then discussing with them and then trying to interrogate Nyong'o on some of the perspectives that he essentially takes, which leads me to the third component in terms of my intervention, what exactly he means in his thesis, which we shall come back to, and more specifically, his emphasis of the basic fact that it has nothing to do with culture or geography, or for that matter, microeconomic principles, all right? It has rather something to do with the innovation or lack of that innovation, the need for more public-private partnerships and infrastructure that, in fact, being variable, that are the variables that have constrained Africa. So the argument I'm going to invite you to think about, or rather the position I'm going to invite you to reflect on, is more or less informed by my suggestion that you look or try to take a geopolitical perspective in trying to appreciate the roles, frameworks that enable description, analysis of post-conflicts or past conflicts, how they break and how they are informed, more specifically by constructions that have to do with actors' ways of viewing their objective reality, especially how they construct their geographies and the implications over that, what type of policies come in, and more specifically, how they grapple with the question of transformation. But more specifically, a push over the same in trying to take a geostrategic or anchoring oneself in strategic studies perspective. It might just help you to try and understand the strategies actors take, the reasons why they take them, the reasons why they fail, the whole question of capabilities, the whole question of intentions, technological or otherwise, right? That then come in, that frame people's appreciations of their reality. I am also going to to salute you more specifically by not focusing yourself more on trends and on incidents, but trying to have clusters of events put together, and that in one way or another can give us an underlying structure that informs a certain behavior pattern that a political actor, or for that matter, a scholar, seems to want to take in trying to understand his objective reality. And so that in itself, and moving further to look at geoeconomics, and more specifically, when you're thinking about the East Asian countries, my appreciation here are that at a certain point or another, one has to begin, or one has to look at these dynamics also in the context of geography. And so when you're looking at geography here, you're thinking about a constant variable here, one in terms of individuals, the human being, as a material component, and the physical aspect of that geography. And so that brings you the second variable here, which is about that aspect of culture, not necessarily culture in terms of how people necessarily live under an assumption that they are locked up in something that is immutable and changing, but rather thinking about culture in terms of strategy. In other words, what we call strategic culture. And in trying to think about strategic culture here, you might want to understand what is it that is unique about the East Asian states. I would only want to think about strategic culture here in terms of organizing or provide, or a set of leaders being given a framework within which they organize their realities in terms of trying to respond to dynamics of threat. And so what then happens is that out of that kind of strategic culture, actors are left to grapple with two issues. One, either strategic culture as an objective strategic culture, or as a subjective strategic culture. And when it becomes a subjective strategic culture, then a number of the issues that Nyong'o is grappling up with become very apparent, and we shall be looking at that. But when it is objective, then we are beginning to talk about aspects that Nyong'o is also preoccupied with, and those are aspects of planning, aspects of long-range conceptualizations of direction, vision in terms of where one wants to take the state, the thought or constant reflections on the question of infrastructure that is necessary, on the questions of conception of the role function of governments, in this case as providers of enabling logistics to their populations, unlike the tendency in Africa within which the enabling aspect of the government here is more inclined to trying to support the external actor rather than their own citizens. So having given you that little bit of appreciations in terms of the initial thoughts with respect to this intervention, one has to think about Nyong'o and try to capture him the way you would think about your reading of what you call the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. So in the Iliad, you first of all begin to see the aspect of irrational passion, the whole question of courage, all of them that have to do with youth. But by the time you're reading Odyssey, you're thinking about the rationalities of old men as they are driven by loyalty and commitment to something much bigger. You're thinking in Iliad, you're looking at strength, but here in Odyssey, you begin to think about what you call mental endurance. And in the case of Nyong'o, you have to think about an individual who has been forged over time in space through personal tragedies, having an elder brother thrown over the ferry, finding yourself exiled and finding yourself cut off from the environment that sustains you, the academia, and having to journey all the way through, still trying to grapple with one fundamental question, like Odysseus here, whether you be gripped by the desire of great things in terms of being rich and what have you, or whether in fact your loyalty to a bigger ideal and commitment to it will enable you to want to go home where you essentially belong. So from the journeys all the way from Mexico and back into the trenches of what you call struggles for political pluralism in Kenya is one way I think one would want to understand Nyong'o, so that by the time you're thinking about what is making him mellow down, you may want to look at it in terms of also trying to understand or having developed that aspect of archaeology. Historians are good at that. In archaeology, there are two fundamental elements here. One is the element of time, and two is the element of patience. You have no choice. You got to have the two to be able to grapple through the dynamics. If you're in a hurry, forget it. So what you see here is basically an organic intellectual who is converging two fundamental issues here. Still loyal to academia, still loyal to theory, but more specifically being practical in terms of what he thinks the society should be and how it should head. So this puts him more specifically, or enables us to try and understand the running perspectives that he has, right? And that's why we began by trying to argue that culture here and geography is still fundamental, but it's a strategic culture we are interested in here. And so when we think about strategic culture here, we are beginning to think about how that informs leadership. And so when he makes very interesting pointers of what he was being told here, the case of the Malaysian leaders coming to Nairobi and finding a very well-developed transport system, and then several years down the road, you have what you're experiencing right now in Nairobi. It becomes a very important pointer here into asking yourself what essentially happened. And that is the point at which he ends a larger part of his debate. Why is it that we cannot be able to maintain our infrastructure? That question, I'll revert to it. But more specifically here in understanding strategic culture as development of long-range planning, long-range thinking, which provides an aspect of insight, an aspect of oversight, and an aspect of the use of that process of what you're calling strategic intelligence that is then able to make you see where you want to essentially go. So now imagine a situation where this process is cut short, right? And when he's looking at Mboya here, it's not, and I agree with you, it's not a question of Mboya as an individual who is perfect, but it's a question of Mboya who is coming up with a document that is supposed to generate a certain debate, a certain appreciations about alternatives. Incidentally, in that period of the 60s, part of the discussion of the sessional paper number 10 of 1965 was carried out here in Taifa Hall. But more fundamental here is in terms of how this lack of alternative thought produces an inverted sense of what you call rentierism, authoritarian culture, the deconstruction of a state. And now when aspects of killings begin to take place, what you end up then happening over is the absence of what he's talking about. Instead of innovation, you have the instrumentalization of identities. And if you look at the Kenyan society, the extent of instrumentalization is consistently a reminder in what you call tensions and reversals that take place every now and then when we attempt to hold elections. And the net result is that every time we do that, there's a huge percentage of the GDP that is swallowed away by those extreme levels of instrumentalized identities and violence that takes place. But more fundamentally, going to the aspect of geography, which he points to, one has to think in terms of the implication of the deconstruction of the East African community, understanding that the states in the Horn of Africa and East Africa were a function of strategic imaginations or imperatives of the British imperialism. And so the deconstruction itself without an alternative, I would invite you as historians to think about their costs. So that is not just limited to the question of the infrastructure, but it is the implication of that infrastructure towards trying to open up what were closed spaces and limiting people's movements in terms of investments and all that Nyong'o is talking about. So to move very fast, just two fundamental questions over here. It is the argument he has with Huntington, which the author has elaborated on very well. And what is very fundamental for us over here is the development of theory in terms of state and its consolidation, and more specifically, the resolution of that artificial tension in terms of imagining that democracy by itself is antithetical to development, and that development itself does not necessarily need democracy. And so the argument here is that, in fact, you need all these variables together. You need education, you need accountability, and you need the rule of law, which is very critical over here. So we stand with you in bearing that aspect. More as a parting note is that question of why we can't maintain our infrastructure. So you need to get into the debate Nyong'o has had all the way in his career in IPA. You have the paper from sessional paper number 10 to 1965 to structural adjustment programs. The whole role of indigenizing policy is there. The problem with that construction was the notion that our major problem in Africa was lack of what? Policies and what have you. Nyong'o will come to learn that, in fact, that was not necessarily the case. But the fundamental question here remains that of leadership within the strategic culture that we've talked about. He will affirm that more specifically in his discussions, in his writings with the likes of Michael Chege. In one of the papers, he will do a book, rather, in which he arrives at a conclusion. For you to have a proper accountability, you need a parliamentary kind of a system rather than a presidential system. And if you have that, a parliamentary system allows the process of inclusion, the process of participation, the process of constant accountability, which perhaps he borrows or perhaps is a function of his realization having been in South America, rather Latin America, back to Africa, and his journeys in the East. I will stop at that and allow us to engage and interrogate the positions of Keller. So we'll have the first group. All right. We'll take the first three and then allow him to make responses, and then the second category, okay? Please give your name. And then, of course,
thank you very much. This is George Odeng from Department of History and Archaeology, University of Nairobi. Now, to the present, after interrogating Nyong'o's ideas on economic development, according to you, is democracy a panacea for economic development in Kenya? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Wahome Ephraim. My concern here is that this comparison might not be the right one, but we understand the basis of this comparison. That is the works of Professor Anyang Nyong'o. But could there be examples that we need to look at, particularly on the basis of regional cultures? And I'm thinking of Asia as a very competitive environment. You know, the relationship between China and Japan, you know, about the relationship between North and South Korea. And those are important motivators of the kind of development we are seeing in those particular areas. And probably we need to look at it from a geographical perspective, as Professor Musambai has just said. But I'm thinking more from a comparative perspective. South America, North America. Could there be issues that can be borrowed from some of those kinds of comparison, even within Africa? As we talk about your area of interest, that is the works of Professor Anyang Nyong'o, could there be leads outside the Kenyan case, outside the Kenya-Asia case, that may give us some more direction in terms of democratic space, corruption, and the contribution of time in development? Thank you.
thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Professor. I'm Marco Tiende, one of your students in political science some years back. Now, I have two concerns to put across, and this is from the presentation. One, I want to know if we are still walking or we are running. Then secondly, I want to know, where did our democracy fail to provide answers to, in which we could compare ourselves to the Asian tigers? Thank you.
You know, our guest speaker is interested in you giving him positions that you think, not necessarily trying to answer the questions in terms of what happened to your democracy. If you have an idea about how your democracy has degenerated and it's affecting what you're calling the development, he would like to hear that. All right, so please. Is that there? Oh,
Yes.
yeah, one, last one, then we go to the next.
Thank you, Prof, for that very interesting exchanges of the ideas that Kevin put across. You've talked a lot about Professor Chege. I think later in the semester I will be here speaking on some aspects on balancing. So please be available to listen to him. And we welcome you to history. We welcome you to history.
Thank you.
We were classmates, so I went to history, went to political science, so we have a lot to share. Now, Kevin, thank you so much for this presentation. Very interesting, very deep. I have two small issues to pick up from with you. One actually has been alluded to by Professor Wahome and also Professor Msambai when he was giving some kind of discussion to your paper. Because I understand your papers trying to track development in a comparative way between Africa and Asia. And you're trying to use the prism provided by one of our senior scholars, Professor Nyong'o. Now, I find the comparison very interesting, and I just wanted to ask specifically, how does historical experiences of African countries and those of Asia generally, not necessarily confined to East Asia, you know, account for these divergences? Because when you look at the history of a number of Asian countries, even those that were colonized by the West, their responses are slightly different from ours. Their social response to colonialism was very different. The classic example I think of, Kevin, is, and I know well, is India, colonized by the British for about 200 years, but it remained India actually socio-culturally. The British were here for hardly 7 decades, and we are all changed and converted and becoming probably more Western than the Westerners themselves. You know, how does those responses of historical experience explain these divergences that we see in terms of development between Africa and Asia? The second one, let me look at Professor Anyang Nyong'o, a very good friend of mine and the mentor. I've done 1 or 2 things with Prof outside the academic arena. Professor Nyong'o is a product of the late colonial modernity in Kenya. A lover of you know, Romeo and Juliet and Macbeth. You know, he played some parts in Alliance in some of these Shakespearean plays. And it seems to me that when you read a number of his writings, he comes across as a product of the gatekeeper late colonial period state, you know, which was developmentalist in nature. And that's why I always see him as a proponent of a developmentalist state, as opposed to a socio-democratic state that he talks about a lot in his politics. And I will want you, Kevin, to respond to that. Am I right in thinking that way and drawing a dichotomy of Professor Nyong'o's you know, writings, which seem to me to point to a developmentalist state, which is a product of the gatekeeper state, both in the colonial and post-colonial era in Kenya? Thank you.
Could you respond to some of those issues, Keller, if you're getting us right? If not, we can
Yes.
have questions for you.
No, these are wonderful questions. And thank you so much for your remarks on the paper. It really is a privilege to have someone reading it so closely and thinking so deeply about the questions I'm raising, the evidence I'm sharing. I'm trying to think of how I can answer these questions in maybe a little bit more of a synthetic way rather than just going down. I think I'll start with a few of the questions we've been discussing. It's sort of I think I could characterize them as questions about whether or not Nyong'o was right on the merits. Sort of the questions of, is democracy a precondition for growth? Why has Kenya grown more slowly than many countries in East Asia? And on those questions, sort of unfairly, I'll just say that I don't have a great answer. I certainly don't have an answer that I think is worth sharing with a room of academics. That my interest is more in seeing how has East Asian economic growth affected the way other people think about economic growth. And here, I think this provides a good point to think about one of the last questions that was raised, which is whether East Asian economic growth is even like a relevant point of comparison. And even if it is a relevant point of a comparison, if it's an important one. And I think something I should emphasize is this talk focused on how Nyong'o compared Kenya and Africa with East Asia, but East Asia was by no means the only point of comparison that he ever turned to. Like I said, he most frequently thinks about Kenyan politics and Kenyan economic growth in the context of African patterns. But he also looks at South America. I think there are other parts of the world he looks at. I'm just focusing on East Asia because over the past few years, it's become sort of a highly political salient question, and because East Asia came to occupy a larger part of Nyong'o's thinking. By no means the only thing he was thinking about, but it rose in stature in his thinking. And of course, this is something that Nyong'o recognized. It wasn't a perfect comparison, that the geography of East Asia is different. The culture of East Asia is different. The nature of the colonial project in East Asia was different in different parts of East Asia and was different than it was in Africa. There are all sorts of reasons that even if there did exist an East Asian model, it wouldn't really make sense to transplant it elsewhere. But nonetheless, I think what Nyong'o does is he sort of breaks apart different elements of the East Asian experience and asks whether and to what degree they can be relevant for Kenya and for other countries across Africa. Like I think some people in the chat, I'm very sort of taken by the idea of looking at Nyong'o's journey as sort of a reflection of the Iliad and the Odyssey. I think the fact that he literally circulated the world in this journey of his makes it a pretty apt comparison. And so I'll have to think more about that. I hope that I am able to come back to Nairobi at some point soon. I made 2 trips in the process of working on my dissertation and working on this project. So hopefully I can find another research fellowship that'll take me out there. And then I'll be sure to talk to the scholars that were brought up in this discussion. I tried to meet with Professor Nyong'o when I was there last time, but my understanding is that maybe he was having things were happening that made him unable to have an appointment when I was there, but hopefully I can make it back at some point soon. The idea of looking at this through the literature, through the ideas around strategic behavior and geostrategic behavior is a totally fascinating one. And thank you for that. I'll need to do more reading in those areas because, like you mentioned, the question that I'm discussing in this paper about how people perceive their environment and how people understand the best ways to achieve their objectives is like an old question. It's a classic question. There's an entire fields of writing around it. So I take the point that I should dig deeper into that. And then the final note I'll say, and I apologize if I've missed any of the questions that were raised already. is that this idea that Nyong'o was both an academic and a politician, I think is what makes him a really valuable person to research. That it's unusual, I think, or in the research I've conducted so far, it's unusual to find someone who has both written about questions of development really deeply from an academic perspective, and then has actually had to try to develop a country or a province or a city or whatever level of government they work in. And so I think it provides an interesting chance to trace over time how these ideas mellow out, or in some cases become a little sharper or change over time. Yeah, it seems unusual and therefore very valuable to find someone who is sort of top of the field in both theory and practice. So again, thank you for all these questions.
You can read me? All right. There were 3 questions probably you could respond to. One is the nexus between a developmental state and social development or social state development. Your thoughts about that? There was a question on the nexus between the historical experiences and the role of the post-colonial appreciation of dynamics in terms of shaping Nyong'o's thought process or ideas. Then there is also a question with respect to whether you actually still think then therefore that we are still walking instead of running. And another question that has been posed to you is more a return to the geographical perspective here, and from a comparative sense of it, when you're talking about East Asia and therefore correlating it to Africa. And I think it falls back to the earlier intervention I had essentially made. And so here, if you take a geostrategic perspective, you have to think about how, for instance, these states undertake their process of planning and how African states find themselves caught up in that web of planning. So in the case of Africa, you're talking about what? They are caught up in the European web of strategic geopolitical thinking and planning. And now you have the East Asia. And so the whole aspect of the debt over here is a cyclic dynamic that makes it harder for them to fall out of. So that was one of the other questions. And then, of course, the last one is where you place. I think it's restating because you had tried to belabor that, whether you actually think, probably let me phrase this in the sense that, or in the sense of whether you think democracy is that preconditions for development, or the development, in that case, if you take a Huntingtonian kind of a sense, and given the type of identity dynamics in Africa, may not necessarily benefit out of that aspect of democracy. Summarized your questions. If there's any one last question from anybody? Okay, you can respond to those ones. Thank you.
Terrific. I'll start with the last one. Do I personally think that a democracy is a precondition for development, or do I sort of subscribe to what we can just sort of label the Huntington view, that democracy might be something we need to postpone in order to get to development? Sort of the awful answer is that, like, it all depends on how you define development. That if you define development as getting rich and powerful, I think that East Asia offers a pretty compelling argument in favor of the idea that democracy is not necessary for wealth. However, if you define development a little more broadly as living sort of development at a personal level, is the ability to live a life in which you have choices in front of you and you can express yourself and direct your life in the way you want, then I do think democracy is a necessary component of that. I think that where I come down on is that I sort of see the synthesis that Nyong'o makes later in his career as a pretty convincing one, that democracy is important, but it's not. Democracy is sort of an absolutely non-bargainable aspect of where we're trying to go, and it is something that we should always try to aspire to en route. But at the same time, we have to pay sort of constant specific attention to material well-being. And it's difficult because that argument loses sort of the sharpness and the appeal that we see earlier in Nyong'o's career and in Samuel Huntington's work, where Nyong'o says earlier in his career, you need democracy first. Huntington says earlier in his career, democracy is not important. Sort of that's a simplification of both of them, but I think it's a useful one. The appeal of both of those is it offers a very actionable political program. But I think that, again, if I were sort of plucked out of obscurity to become the Minister of National Development, I would come down on where Nyong'o seems to have ended up, that these are both things that we need to keep track of. But again, that's just my opinion. On the question of, is Kenya still walking? Has it started running? Or as some people are mentioning in the chat, is it now crawling? I would just point to like the GDP growth statistics. I think maybe an interesting way of asking this question is turning it around and say, was Asia in fact running? Or were there aspects of the East Asian growth experience that maybe weren't that attractive? So sort of the classic example of this, and the one that sort of everyone recognizes, is that China had sort of astonishing economic growth for several decades in a row. But for much of that time, there was also pretty severe environmental degradation, pollution problems, sort of in the water, in the soil, and the air. And the reason I mention that is that sort of this image of East Asia running while the rest of the world walks focuses on like a very narrow set of indicators to determine the speed at which development is happening. And I think the indicators, GDP, global or national production figures, I think those are absolutely important. But they're also incomplete. And so I think that this idea of some countries running and other countries walking based on GDP figures sort of reinforces a very narrow idea of what counts for development, which is something that Nyong'o was sort of fighting against since the earliest phases of his career. I've sort of been wriggling away from the question. If the question is again posed to me, is the general dynamic that's described of East Asia running while Africa walks? I would need to look at the GDP figures again, but I think again, if we're looking at GDP, there has been some closing of the gap, but I think that East Asia is still posting better figures. But I would need to look at the data before I say that conclusively. In terms of, as I understand the question, should we look at Peter Anyang Nyong'o as sort of a product of thinking about the developmental state in the middle of the 20th century? It's interesting. I had not thought about him that way, though, of course, as soon as the question's raised, I wonder why I haven't. I would have to think about that more a little bit. I think it's a really interesting question. but I don't have very coherent thoughts about it right now. I think that, so there are two questions that I still haven't really addressed, and I'm afraid that on those two, I also just don't really have, I think, answers that'll be very satisfactory. I think on the question of geography and the role geography plays in all of this, I'm trying to go back through my mind to think about whether, when I was reading, did Nyong'o have comments about geography? In the speech that sort of formed the center of the presentation, the speech, Why Did We Walk While Asians Ran? I mentioned that Nyong'o sort of casually did away with the idea that geography explained differences. I think it's an interesting source, and I think Nyong'o is an interesting figure to sort of grapple with, because that speech is an example of something that Nyong'o did pretty often, which is, as a politician, he would give speeches that sort of looked like and sounded like academic discussions, but I think were not, and were rather political statements. So like I mentioned in the paper, this discussion, Why Did We Walk While Asians Ran? He says the difference is not geography, the difference is not culture, the difference is not adhering to external guidelines. The reason is that there's a lack of public-private partnerships and a lack of innovation. Like, maybe that's what he believed, maybe that's what he gathered from the data, maybe that's what he learned from his research, but it also might be that that was like the convenient and helpful message to be shared at this particular venue, which was a meeting with Asian diplomats. And so it's sort of, when I'm looking at these papers, it's interesting. When I see this speech, I don't know whether I can say Nyong'o discounted the importance of geography versus Nyong'o, as Minister of National Development, wanted to gin up partnerships with East Asian companies, and therefore in this talk with East Asian diplomats, he really harped on the importance of public-private partnerships and sort of maybe emphasized, maybe overemphasized what he called the lack of innovation in the Kenyan economy to sort of build excitement about the possibility of partnerships. And so anyway, all of this is to say, what role does geography play in all of this? I don't personally have any fully formed ideas. I would need to go back and look through Nyong'o's work to see what his ideas are. But I think that sort of a challenge in looking, something that's challenging, something that's exciting about his work is that it can be, you sort of really have to, I think you really have to pay attention to the venue in which these ideas were shared. And I think the venue often affected the message pretty significantly.
All right. We want to thank you very much for your engagement. Perhaps when you come to Kisumu, take a boat trip with Nyong'o. Ask him a little bit about the variables of being reconnected to the Great Lakes region. Ask him what he thinks about Uhuru Kenyatta and the railway and the infrastructure around Kisumu as a governor. And I guess what has happened is that he goes back to that question of geography when he favors the redevelopment of the railway systems that reconnected the whole East African region. So that is the point you should make sure that you take that trip around the lake over that, so you understand that bit, the distance decay dynamics of the rail. All the best in your work. And hold on. Oh, I am reminded that there were some online questions. Did you pick any?
Let me look at the chat right now. Before I do that, I will say one of the reasons I came across Nyong'o is because my dissertation, which focuses mostly on the standard gauge railway, I was really interested that he is one of the sort of rare relatively pro voices, one of the relatively supportive of the standard gauge railway, and that if you look at sort of policy programs he's come up for Kisumu County, it's all about sort of the possibilities that the railway offers to Kisumu, which of course is a very interesting comparison with everything you see coming out of Mombasa, which is where this railway threatens to really harm a local economy. It was interesting to look at his perspective, where if everything worked out according to the plans, this could sort of stimulate what was going on there. But anyway, it would be a dream come true if I could go on a boat ride with him. Let me look at the questions. One question is, can we blame our development challenges to democratic backsliding or to our inability to adopt China's disciplined democracy? Again, I'll defer to sort of the experts in this room, who I think have a much more informed opinion on this. For the next question, Professor Nyong'o used both the critical essay and the personal essay. Did I examine the aesthetics of his message? I think this is a wonderful question. And it's one, partly because I'm a historian and I sort of struggled to figure out how this distinction, which seems obviously important, would affect the historical questions I was studying. I will say that I didn't, like I mentioned with the speech he gave, Why Did We Walk Where the Asians Ran? I always tried to pay attention to who is the intended audience and sort of what response do you want to evoke in the audience. I think that his personal essays, and most of the personal essays I read were related to his experiences in politics in the 1990s and were pretty bitter. I think when I was reading the personal essays, I tried to keep in mind that sort of as we've been talking about throughout the question and answer session, Nyong'o was like very clearly trying to process very difficult experiences he had gone through that affected himself and his family. And I tried to look at those personal essays not as sort of objective accounts of what happened in the 1990s and the 1980s, but rather as like the recollections of someone who participated in those events, and specifically the recollections that that person who was still involved in politics wanted to share. And then I see a question here at the bottom. I'm not sure it's a question. Yeah, I think so. This is sharing another sort of perspective on how the various issues we've been discussing have affected Kenya's ability to achieve or not to achieve a developmental state. I think I'll use it perhaps as like a small hook to talk a little bit about why I discussed Tom Mboya so much in this paper, even though it's not technically about him. That Tom Mboya really he appeared all over Nyong'o's writings. And I think it was interesting that Nyong'o was like very clearly sort of looking all over the place for sort of models, sources of information, sources of wisdom. And Tom Mboya was very clearly one of them. That even when Nyong'o was trying to make sense of what was going on in East Asia and figure out what East Asia could tell him about what to do in Kenya, he was always in the back of his mind. The Tom Mboya both sort of underscored to him the importance of the task at hand and the possibility of what he might be able to achieve if he got this right, and sort of presented one model of what Kenya should do that I think Nyong'o didn't entirely agree with, but was sort of a reference point that he was always thinking about. So yeah, thank you for the questions in the chat.
who wants to voice their questions, you're welcome. Anybody? If there isn't, how about in the audience? Yes, please. Your name? There is who? Boniface Igumba, you ready?
Hello. Yeah, my question is it possible that even if, though Africa has been not only walking, but even crawling, could it be that somebody has been holding its legs back so that it could not run? Like we talk of imperialism, the kind of geopolitics that happen around Africa, how we are influenced to make some decisions the way we make. We have seen even ourselves behaving in a manner like, because we have said we found the coffers empty, we want them to be empty again when somebody else is coming in. Could such be the reason as to why we are crawling?
Your name?
Tony Mochama with the Nation Media. And I was in China for an AI and arts conference quite recently. That's relevant. I'm not just talking about a trip. What does our very learned friend put up about this hypothesis? When you study every Asian tiger, you realize right from World War II, whether it's the rebuilding of Japan, the Americans were there. All those countries, they were being used always as industrial bases. Singapore, we seem to never really talk about this. And even the Chinese, the rise of the dragon, I mean, they already have their own ancient, even manufacturing cultures. We won't go into ancient history. But right now, a lot of their boom has also got to do with the fact that jobs, their labor was cheap, so a lot of serious industries moved there, whether it's Apple, you know, name it, all the giants. It was the same thing with cars in Japan. It's not that, although the Japanese already had industrial capability. So how come we never talk about, where would you place a country like Kenya? We've got, of course, a damned corruption, and, you know, some people say a lack of innovation, but we've never really had India. It's also happening with the India, that they boom when the West go there because people do take over their technologies, because people are smart. The Asians are smart. They start by pirating and they end up by producing even better things. So where do you place the fact that we don't get to attract this type of, you know, people we can copycat from, pirate, rip off from, and then use our natural intelligence to become tigers also?
So Keller, it's part of the extended geopolitics issues, geoeconomics, and what have you. Please go ahead.
So I think these are wonderful questions again. On the sort of the theory that Mr. Ngumba put forward about sort of the structures that are in place that make it in everyone's interest to empty the coffers before someone else gets there. From what I've read, I mean, that sounds right. That sounds convincing. I don't think I have anything to add. On the question about what is sort of the kernel that is shared by all the East Asian tigers, I think there's the whole field of literature about this. I think there's ideas that it's sort of export discipline that causes these countries to jump ahead. You have theories that are related to culture and the role of Confucianism. You have theories about sort of the educational system, and all these theories sort of wax and wane in terms of prominence. But I think the question is right, that one feature that is shared is that a lot of these countries, I guess I'm not sure about Hong Kong and Singapore, but the other countries really gained a lot of strength by becoming manufacturing hubs, and especially relying on low-cost labor to manufacture products, largely for markets in the United States and Europe. There's a book coming out. It's either coming out very, very soon or just recently came out by Professor Ingelsson at the London School of Economics, which makes this really interesting point that even though the United States and China sort of suddenly are seen as enemies that are contending for control over the world, the United States sort of very self-consciously and intentionally played a really large role in turning China into an economic power. And that the sort of conflict that we see right now, or this interaction that a lot of people see as sort of inevitable conflict, is the result of intentional policies for several decades, and policies from which the United States benefited pretty enormously. To the question of should Kenya now try to slot itself in this tradition, there's a lot of ideas among thinkers in China, for example, that sort of the next, now that China is growing in power, sort of the next stage is that these low-wage industries should go to other countries. And you see, for example, factories throughout Africa that are owned by Chinese, by people from China and operated by people from China. Again, the question of whether this is a good idea, whether it will be successful, I'm very reluctant to hesitate to offer any predictions. But I agree with your very general point that sort of an element in the process of getting rich for many of these countries was manufacturing those then exported to richer countries.
Yes, please. By the way, Monchumba, the question you've just raised to our colleague, I don't know if you remember of the manufacturing attempts that were being done in Thika, Roundup, what do you call it, Land Rover and all that. So indeed, it has been there. Perhaps what you may want to make a contribution to is what then happened. And that's why that aspect of strategic culture comes in, especially a subjective one and all that. But it's a very valid question in terms of how certain regions will move because of certain networks or infrastructure that are attracting them within a certain kind of geopolitical dynamics. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. I'm Joseph Mwangi from Kenyatta University. Then last conversation, I was privileged to hear from Dr. Kimingichi on oral literature. And one of his stories, it is just paraphrasing it, he said that the Bukusuman, when he borrows an axe, he doesn't use the axe until the tree falls. He just maybe cut the tree thrice and start pushing the tree to fall. So relating to the presentation, maybe I can ask, did we borrow maybe the unsharpened axe, not worthy to be used to cut the African tree or the African problems? At the moment we try to cut the tree, it remains futile and untenable. Second, do we behave like the proverbial Bukusuman that we hit the tree thrice and start pushing the tree down to fall? That's why we are walking and not running. And the third, if not so, it is either maybe the axe which we borrowed, it is not to be used by Africans completely, or maybe we are suited to use another tool. Thank you.
So I don't know whether you got the question, but if you didn't, we shall appeal to the historians and the anthropologists over here to respond to it. There is also work on the line. Please do go waka. Karibu.
Thank you, moderator. Thank you, our presenter, Kevin. Yes, I've enjoyed the discussion. A small question that is disturbing me. You mentioned Tom Mboya, you mentioned the sessional paper number 10 of 1965. Two questions that come to mind. In your view, since you are the researcher, I haven't done any work on this area. Since you have read on Mboya and the paper, is there any influence that Anyang Nyong'o gets from Tom Mboya? And
Hello?
Hello, are you there?
Dr. Waka,
Yes.
kindly retake your question. We didn't get you.
Sorry, I'm asking any influence that Mboya had on Peter? Question one. Am I okay there? And two, I was just wondering, now that the sessional paper number 10 was so significant in Kenya's development planning, where did the rain start beating us? Because we seem to have lost the way, as the man was just asked about the axe. Are we using a blunt sessional paper that is clueless? We have never refined it. Thank you so much.
I think these are wonderful questions. Oh, sorry. Should I take these two questions?
Could you try to reconnect?
So I think these are great questions. On the question of the axe, I think that this is sort of the central question that Nyong'o is grappling with, is to what extent should this axe, which I understand is the developmental model, to what extent should it be taken sort of wholesale and applied to Kenya? And I think his answer is it should not, that there are some ways in which it needs to be adapted to suit the local context. To the question of to what extent was Nyong'o sort of, what did he agree with and what did he not agree with in sessional paper number 10? And to what extent can we connect his thoughts on development to Tom Mboya's? I would need to look through sessional paper number 10 again to have a really detailed answer. I think at a sort of higher level, Mboya was a very, I think, maybe safe to say non-ideological approach to development, that he was comfortable. He was sort of hard to pin down. But of course, famously, it was called a plan for African socialism. It didn't seem terribly socialist in nature. And Mboya seems to work pretty hard to sort of keep his options open in terms of who he would work with. I think that's fair to say. The more I think about it, I'm not certain how much what I'm saying is correct. I think what I'm trying to get at is that both Mboya and Nyong'o seem to be very sort of flexible and maybe empirical, that they seemed very curious to sort of figure out what ideas were out there for development. I mean, maybe what I'm trying to say is that they're both just very good politicians. But for example, you have the story about Tom Mboya giving speeches in the United Kingdom and being celebrated for his incredible grasp of knowledge and becoming sort of like a star of African nationalism that everybody wanted to support. And I think in many ways, that's sort of what Nyong'o is doing now, that he's giving speeches at Harvard. He's going around the world, sort of becoming a figure that people all around the world are very excited to support. And so like that isn't sort of an alignment of specific policies that are being promoted by these two men, but I do think it is a mode of being an African politician, one that's very oriented towards the outside world and very savvy about getting support from outside of Kenyan's borders, that I do think is a very clear through line between the two of them. Oh, I think I cannot hear what's happening in the room.
The statement.
Perfect.
Thank you, Professor Mzambai. That's a loaded statement. In Africa, power is never handed over peacefully. At least you have done so. Mine is just simple. Probably, Keller, in your last statement about TJ Mboya, is in a category of the people I call socialists without socialism, along with the late Jaramogi Oginga Odinga. And Mboya is in a class of the group that was propped up by the late colonial modernity because they were malleable enough to be useful in a post-colonial setting when London was not in charge, but it will be indirectly in charge. I hope right in the reading of Mboya. Whether he was ideologically inclined to be comparable to Nyong'o, I'm not quite sure, but it's something we will need to revisit at some point. But I would want to doubt that. Now, mine here, friends, is that we have come to the end of this session today. We have our next seminar on the 14th of March, 2024, same place, same room, same Department of History and Archaeology. And for our online participants, actually, you register using the same link. The seminar on the 14th, our presenter will be a very renowned environmental conservationist, award-winning John Kamanga of Soralo, who is a CEO of a non-governmental organization called Soralo. He will be talking about culture, conservation, and history, an intricate relationship. Our moderator and discussant will be none other than Faith Alube from the Kenya Land Alliance. We want to bring them to these corridors of the academy and hear what they have been doing out there. These friends of ours from the other side accuse us of being abstract. Now we are bringing them to the abstract platform so that they can test what we have been doing. That's one way of really bringing down history from the ivory tower, taking to the streets and listening to our colleagues and informing them that history has a place in societal organization and reorganization. If we want to imagine and reimagine a better Kenya, then you cannot run away from history, my friends. That's a fairly utilitarian approach to historical study, but it's allowed, as my classmate is saying here. Let me thank our presenter this Nairobi afternoon. I'm sure it's now late in the night in Shanghai. Thank you, Kevin Keller, for coming in very handy. And thanks for persevering my constant probe and numberless emails until we have made it. And we look forward to seeing you in Nairobi when you will talk to us face to face. Professor Mzambai, thank you very much for allowing me to dictate you a little bit. Probably that's what classmates and good friends are all about. I never give you a chance to breathe or say no. So thank you for allowing me to do that as a good brother. Colleagues from our University of Nairobi, I saw quite a number of colleagues online from the Department of Literature, Department of Political Science. I saw colleagues like Dr. Ambassador Richard Bosire was with us, Professor Miriam Musonye, Dr. Saji, our good friend, and Jerry Muholo, they were all in. Our friends from Kenyatta University, one of them is here, and I saw my good friend, Dr. Elliot Piagon online. Send our regards to our colleagues. Our friends from Makerere University, I saw Liz Minsa always attending these functions. Our friends from the United States, Korea, and also I saw our regular friends from India. Our MA students, well done. You attended this session just like you do other sessions very well. I will urge our PhD students to pull up their socks. I hardly see many of them here. Please, our PhD students, wherever you are listening to me, we need you here. Our logistics team, led by none other than our departmental registrar, Amos, and your team, Elizabeth, Christine Ndabuki, and James Nyaga. Wonderful team to work with. Wonderful, great people to work with. And our friends, Delta Media, led by my brother Isaiah Masese and Marvin Davis. Very well, this young man, we go to the same church here in Nairobi, SDA Church, Karangata. But they do a good job in enabling us to record these proceedings and upload them in our departmental YouTube channel. So for some reason, if you missed today's presentation, all you need to do is to just go to YouTube, Google the Department of History and Archaeology, University of Nairobi, and you'll watch all the past proceedings of the last 4 years, and we'll be able to upload this one by Monday, Isaiah, by Monday, and Amos, so you can go and watch today's proceedings. With those many remarks, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. God bless you. See you on the 14th. Our media people, my very good village mate and brother, Tony Mochama, thank you very much. I saw some of your colleagues online, a few from Citizen. That's a good show that we are appealing to the public in these programs. You're coming in late in the semester. I've asked you to coordinate something for us, and we appreciate that. Thank you very much, Tony, as always. Have a good evening here in Nairobi, a good morning in America, and a good night in Asia.